When an American soldier met a Japanese nurse on the battlefield, he never expected mercy from the enemy. But as he lay bleeding in the mud of a foreign jungle, it was her gentle hands that saved his life. The year was 1918. A war raged that turned men into monsters and divided humanity by borders and uniforms. Yet in one remote camp on Luzon, something extraordinary was happening. She risked everything, her freedom, her honor, her very life, to tend his wounds, a forbidden act of compassion that would change them both forever. But not everyone believes in mercy during wartime. As whispers spread through the camp, danger closes in like jungle shadows. Stolen medical supplies, a hidden knife, accusations that could mean death, two souls from enemy nations, connected by a moment of humanity in a world gone mad. Their story echoes across time, a testament to the power of compassion when hatred seems the easier path. What happens when the boundaries between friend and foe dissolve? Can true understanding bloom in the harsh soil of war? And in a world determined to keep them apart, will their unexpected bond survive the forces that threaten to destroy it? The jungle air felt thick as soup. Private Thomas Weller dragged himself through the mud, each movement sending sharp pain through his bleeding leg. The sounds of gunfire had faded, but the smell of smoke and gunpowder still hung in the air. "Help!" he tried to call, but his voice came out as a whisper. His throat burned with thirst. The skirmish with the Japanese troops had scattered his unit. Now he was alone, crawling inch by inch toward the sound of running water. His vision blurred. Black spots danced before his eyes. Thomas collapsed beside a small creek. The cool water lapped at his fingers, but he couldn't find the strength to cup his hands and drink. His leg throbbed where the bullet had torn through. "I reckon this is it," he murmured to himself, thinking of his mother back in Iowa. The farm would be green now, corn starting to grow tall. He'd never see it again. A shadow fell across his face. Thomas blinked, trying to clear his vision. Someone stood over him. It was a woman, small, with dark hair pulled back from her face. She wore a simple uniform, dirty and torn at the edges. Her eyes widened when she saw his American uniform. Thomas tensed, recognizing the Japanese insignia on her sleeve. A nurse from the enemy forces. She glanced over her shoulder. In the distance, American voices called out, searching. She could run, should run. Instead, she knelt beside him. "Water," Thomas croaked. Without a word, she dipped her canteen in the creek and brought it to his lips. The water felt like heaven as it flowed down his parched throat. "Thank you," he whispered. The woman didn't smile. Her face remained serious as she examined his wounded leg. Blood had soaked through his pant leg, turning the fabric dark and sticky. She reached for the sash around her waist, untied it with quick fingers, and wrapped it tightly around his thigh. Thomas winced at the pressure, but knew it might save his life by stopping the bleeding. "Why?" he asked, confused by her kindness. She placed a finger to her lips, then pointed to his chest. "Heart," she said in heavily accented English. She tapped her own chest. "Same." The voices grew louder. American soldiers were getting closer. The woman gathered her few things. She hesitated, then placed her canteen beside Thomas. "Name?" he asked weakly. "Aiko," she replied softly. "Aiko Tanaka." Then she was gone, disappearing into the reeds as silently as she had appeared. Thomas watched her go, fighting to stay awake. The last thing he saw before darkness took him were distant lanterns bobbing through the trees. Thomas woke to the sound of canvas flapping in the breeze. He blinked at the bamboo and canvas ceiling above him. Pain throbbed in his leg, but it was duller now, wrapped in clean bandages. "Well, look who decided to join the living," a cheerful voice said. Thomas turned his head to see a corporal sitting on a nearby cot, rolling bandages. "Where am I?" Thomas asked, his voice raspy. "Field hospital, about 10 miles from where you went down." The corporal passed him a cup of water. "You're lucky to be alive, son. Lost a lot of blood." Thomas drank deeply, then asked, "Who found me?" "Search party. You were passed out by the creek, but someone had tied off your leg." The corporal grinned. "Must have had some Jap angel watching over you." Thomas spotted the canteen sitting on a small table beside his cot. Japanese characters were etched into its side. "This was with me?" he asked, reaching for it. "Yep. Colonel figured you took it off an enemy soldier." The corporal leaned closer. "Did you?" Thomas ran his thumb over the strange markings. "Something like that." Outside, soldiers lined up for breakfast. Through the open tent flap, Thomas could see them shuffling forward with tin plates and cups. A group of military police marched by, escorting a small group of Japanese prisoners. "Caught a bunch of them hiding in a cave," the corporal explained, following Thomas's gaze. "Mostly soldiers, but there's a woman too. A nurse." Thomas's heart jumped. "A nurse?" "Yeah, pretty little thing for a Jap." The corporal shrugged. "Don't get any ideas, though. Colonel's keeping them under tight guard." Thomas clutched the canteen. Could it be her? The woman who had saved him? That night, Thomas dreamed of gentle hands offering him water, of dark eyes filled with unexpected kindness. He woke with a start, sweat soaking his shirt despite the cool night air. Outside, boots crunched on gravel. Thomas pushed himself up on his elbows to see military police marching a group of Japanese prisoners past his tent. At the back of the line walked a small figure, head bowed. Even in the dim light, Thomas recognized her. Aiko. 3 days passed before Thomas was strong enough to stand. The doctor gave him crutches, warning him not to put weight on his injured leg. "You're healing well, but don't push it," he cautioned. Thomas nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Every day he watched for Aiko among the prisoners, catching only glimpses as they were taken to work details around the camp. Late that morning, Thomas limped outside for the first time. The sun beat down mercilessly, making him squint. Soldiers moved about the camp, carrying supplies, cleaning weapons, writing letters home. Near the edge of the compound, prisoners filled buckets from a well. Among them stood Aiko, her slender arms straining as she lifted a heavy bucket of water. Thomas made his way slowly toward the well, ignoring the curious glances from his fellow soldiers. As he approached, Aiko looked up. Their eyes met across the dusty yard. Recognition flashed across her face, followed quickly by fear. She lowered the bucket, water sloshing over the sides. "You're not supposed to be talking to the prisoners," a guard warned, stepping between them. "I just need some water," Thomas lied. The guard frowned but stepped aside. Thomas approached the well, positioning himself next to Aiko. "Thank you," he murmured, keeping his voice low, "for saving my life." Aiko kept her eyes on her bucket. "Please, go away," she whispered. "Not safe." An officer strode across the yard, eyes narrowing as he spotted Thomas standing near the prisoners. "Private, what are you doing?" he called. "Getting water, sir," Thomas replied, straightening as best he could on his crutches. The officer's gaze shifted between Thomas and Aiko. "Do you know this prisoner?" Thomas hesitated. Would telling the truth help Aiko, or put her in danger? "I believe she was captured near where I was wounded, sir." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" He turned to Aiko. "Did you encounter this soldier before your capture?" Aiko kept her head bowed, saying nothing. "Answer me," the officer demanded. "She doesn't speak much English, sir," Thomas said quickly. The officer studied him for a long moment. "Return to your tent, Private, now." Thomas had no choice but to obey. As he limped away, he glanced back to see the officer speaking to the guard, both men looking at Iko with suspicion. By lunchtime, whispers spread through the camp. Soldiers gathered in small groups, talking in low voices. Thomas caught fragments as he made his way to the mess tent. "Helped an American? Traitor to her own people. Can't trust any of them." The mood in the camp darkened as the day wore on. Thomas tried to find Aiko, but the prisoners had been confined to their barracks. Guards stood at the doors, faces grim. As evening fell, angry voices rose near the prisoners' quarters. Thomas limped toward the sound, heart pounding. A crowd had gathered, nearly 100 soldiers forming a circle around Aiko's barracks. "Bring her out!" someone shouted. "Let's show her what happens to enemy spies," called another. Lantern light flickered across angry faces. Thomas pushed his way to the front, ignoring the pain in his leg. "Stop this!" he shouted. "You don't know what you're doing." "Get back, Weller," a sergeant ordered. "This isn't your business." "It is my business," Thomas insisted. "She saved my life." A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to Thomas. Before anyone could speak, the sound of boots on gravel silenced them all. Colonel James Harrison strode through the parting crowd, face like thunder. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded. No one answered at first. Then a corporal stepped forward. "Sir, we heard one of the prisoners helped an American soldier. We think she might be a spy." The colonel's eyes found Thomas. "Is this true, Private? Did this prisoner help you?" Thomas straightened, meeting the colonel's gaze. "Yes, sir. She found me by the creek after I was shot. She could have left me to die, but instead, she gave me water and stopped my bleeding." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The colonel raised his hand for silence. "Where is this prisoner now?" The guards brought Aiko out. She stood straight, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The colonel studied her. "What's your name?" Aiko remained silent, eyes downcast. "Her name is Aiko Tanaka," Thomas said. "She's a nurse." "Take her to my office," the colonel ordered, "and clear this area immediately. Any man not at his post in 5 minutes will face disciplinary action." The crowd dispersed quickly. As guards led Aiko away, she glanced back at Thomas. Her eyes held no fear now, only quiet dignity. Thomas paced outside the colonel's office, the thump of his crutches marking time as the minutes stretched on. Inside, the colonel questioned Aiko, his deep voice occasionally rising enough for Thomas to catch words. "Enemy combatant. Regulations. Consequences." Finally, Thomas could wait no longer. He pushed the door open without knocking and stumbled into the room. "Sir, I need to speak with you," he blurted. The colonel looked up sharply. "This is an interrogation, Private. Get out." "Sir, please. She saved my life. I'd be dead if not for her." Aiko sat rigidly in a wooden chair, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't spoken a word, her silence a shield of honor. The colonel sighed heavily. "The men want blood, Weller. They've lost friends to the Japanese. They're angry, scared, and looking for someone to blame." "So blame me," Thomas said fiercely. "Punish me if you have to punish someone, but she showed mercy when she could have walked away." The room fell silent. Outside, rain began to fall, pattering softly on the tin roof. The colonel studied Thomas, then turned to Aiko. "Is what he says true? Did you help him?" Aiko raised her eyes, meeting the colonel's gaze directly for the first time. She gave a single, dignified nod. Why? The colonel asked. He's your enemy. Aiko spoke at last, her voice soft but clear. Not enemy. Human. The colonel leaned back in his chair, weighing her words. After a long moment, he made his decision. Against my better judgment, he said slowly, I'm going to put you to work in the infirmary. We need medical help, and if you're skilled enough to save this man's life with nothing but a sash and a canteen, you might be useful. Officers waiting outside protested when they heard the news. Sir, you can't trust a Jap in our infirmary. She could poison our men. She'll be under guard at all times, the colonel replied firmly, and Private Weller will be personally responsible for her conduct. That night, as rain drummed on canvas, Thomas found Aiko in a corner of the infirmary, rolling bandages by candlelight. Thank you, he said simply. She looked up, her face half in shadow, half in light. I do my duty, to heal, not to hate. Thomas nodded. I understand. As he turned to go, she spoke again. Your name? Thomas, he answered. Thomas Weller. Aiko bowed slightly. Thomas, she repeated softly. Outside, the rain washed the jungle clean, carrying away the day's heat and dust. Inside, in the flickering candlelight, something fragile began to grow, a tiny seed of understanding planted in the harsh soil of war. The morning sun filtered through the canvas roof of the infirmary, casting golden light across rows of cots. Thomas sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His leg still ached, but the sharp pain had dulled to a manageable throb. Outside, the camp stirred to life. Boots crunched on gravel. A bugle sounded. Men shouted orders and jokes across the yard. Thomas reached for his crutches and made his way slowly to the entrance. Through the open flap, he could see soldiers lining up for breakfast rations. Powdered eggs and coffee, hard bread and canned meat. At the edge of his vision, a small figure moved between patients, checking bandages and offering water. Aiko worked steadily, her face serious and focused. A guard stood nearby, rifle at the ready, watching her every move. 2 days had passed since the colonel's decision to let Aiko work in the infirmary. The men still grumbled, but their anger had cooled to wary acceptance. Mornin', Weller, called a corporal named Jim Bailey, passing by with a steaming mug. How's that leg today? Better, Thomas replied. Doc says I might be able to ditch one crutch by the end of the week. Bailey nodded, glancing past Thomas to where Aiko bent over a patient. Still don't know how you convinced the colonel to trust that Jap, he muttered. Her name is Aiko, Thomas corrected gently. And she's a good nurse. Bailey shrugged. If you say so. He lowered his voice. Just watch yourself. Not everyone's happy about her being here. As Bailey walked away, a young private approached Thomas, looking nervous. Sir? The new nurse, the Japanese lady. She fixed up my arm real good yesterday. He held up his bandaged forearm. Could you thank her for me? I don't know how to talk to her. Thomas smiled. Why don't you thank her yourself? She understands. More English than you'd think. The private shook his head. Wouldn't feel right, sir. After what their kind did to my buddy at Pearl Harbor. He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. But good work deserves thanks, my mama always said. I'll tell her, Thomas promised. Later that morning, as Thomas practiced walking with his crutches outside the infirmary, the quartermaster approached him. Weller, the colonel wants you to help translate for the nurse. Says you two seem to understand each other. Thomas nodded. Yes, sir. Basic stuff only, the quartermaster warned. Medical instructions, supply needs, nothing personal, and stay where the guard can see you. Inside the infirmary, Aiko sorted through bottles of medicine, reading labels carefully. The guard stood by the door, eyes half closed in the heat. "The quartermaster says I should help you translate," Thomas said, making his way to her side. Aiko glanced up, a brief smile flickering across her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. Together, they worked through basic medical terms. Aiko knew more English than she let on, but medical words often confused her. Thomas wrote them down: bandage, morphine, fever, stitches, and Aiko repeated them carefully. "In Japanese?" Thomas asked, curious. Aiko hesitated, then wrote characters beside each English word. She guided his hand to form a simple character. "Water," she explained. "Mizu," Thomas tried, his tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sound. Aiko's smile grew wider. "Yes, good." By midday, they had compiled a small dictionary of essential terms. As they worked, Thomas noticed Aiko humming softly, a melody he didn't recognize. "What's that song?" he asked. "Lullaby," she answered, "for children when sick with fever." She glanced toward a soldier who tossed restlessly on his cot, face flushed with infection. That afternoon, as Thomas sat on a bench outside, Aiko emerged from the infirmary carrying torn uniforms. She sat a respectful distance away and began to mend them with neat, precise stitches. Thomas pulled a small notebook from his pocket and began to sketch the mountains visible beyond the camp fence. Art had always calmed him, a habit from childhood when he would draw the Iowa farmland while his father worked the fields. Aiko watched him from the corner of her eye. "You draw well," she said finally. Thomas shrugged. "Just a hobby." "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand. Thomas passed her the notebook and pencil. Aiko's hand moved quickly, creating flowing lines that became a mountain stream, rocks, and delicate trees. "My home," she explained, pointing to the sketch. "Nagano, mountains." "Beautiful," Thomas said honestly. Aiko turned the page and handed the notebook back. "Now your home." Thomas smiled and began to draw. The straight lines of his family's farmhouse, the big oak tree in the yard, fields stretching to the horizon. "Iowa," he explained. "Corn, wheat, cows." As the sun began to set, they shared these pieces of themselves through simple sketches. Her family's small house with its paper screens, his mother's flower garden, the village festival with lanterns, the county fair with its Ferris wheel. Words were still difficult, but pictures bridged the gap between their worlds. When darkness fell, Thomas walked Aiko back to her quarters, a small section of the women's barracks cordoned off from the few female staff. The guard followed a few paces behind. "Thank you," Aiko said softly as they reached the door. "For seeing me, not enemy." Thomas nodded. "Sleep well, Aiko." As he turned away, the pounding of hooves drew everyone's attention. A courier galloped through the main gate, his horse lathered with sweat. He pulled up sharply at the colonel's quarters, leapt down, and rushed inside with a leather pouch. "Must be important," murmured the guard. Thomas had a sudden cold feeling in his stomach. Important news in wartime seldom brought joy. The following morning, tension hung over the camp like storm clouds. Men gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Officers rushed between buildings, faces grim. "What's happening?" Thomas asked Bailey as they stood in line for breakfast. Bailey leaned close. "Rumor is we're pulling back. Japanese are advancing faster than expected." Thomas's thoughts went immediately to Aiko. What would happen to her if they had to evacuate? Inside the infirmary, work continued as usual. Aiko changed bandages and dispensed medicine, seemingly unaware of the camp's unease. But Thomas noticed how she kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone but the patients. Shortly after lunch, a commotion erupted at the supply tent. Thomas hobbled toward the sound, curious. "Theft!" shouted the quartermaster, red-faced with anger. "Someone's stolen morphine!" Soldiers gathered around as the quartermaster explained that during morning inventory, he'd discovered 6 vials missing. "Could have been misplaced," suggested a sergeant. The quartermaster shook his head. "Not likely. We checked everywhere." "When was the last inventory?" asked the colonel, who had arrived amid the commotion. 3 days ago, sir. Everything was accounted for then." The colonel surveyed the crowd, his expression hard. "I want every tent searched. Now." Teams of soldiers spread throughout the camp, turning over cots, searching footlockers, checking every possible hiding place. Thomas made his way back to the infirmary, worry gnawing at him. Aiko continued working, though her hands trembled slightly as she changed a dressing. "You okay?" Thomas asked quietly. She nodded without looking up. An hour later, shouts erupted from behind the infirmary. Thomas hurried outside as fast as his crutches would allow. 2 soldiers emerged from the bushes, triumphantly holding up several small glass vials. "Found 'em! Hidden under some rocks!" The quartermaster rushed forward, examining the vials. "That's them all right." The colonel pushed through the crowd. "Where exactly?" "Right there, sir. Behind the infirmary, near the path to the latrines." All eyes turned toward the infirmary tent, where Aiko stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Bring her here," the colonel ordered grimly. Guards escorted Aiko to stand before the colonel. She kept her head high, though Thomas could see fear in her eyes. "Did you take these?" the colonel asked, holding up the vials. Aiko remained silent. "Answer me," the colonel demanded. "Sir?" Thomas stepped forward, balancing awkwardly on his crutches. "Aiko wouldn't steal. She's been helping us." The colonel raised a hand to silence him. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Private." He turned back to Aiko. "As a prisoner of war, theft of medical supplies is a serious offense. If found guilty, you'll be transferred to the penal colony on Samar Island." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew what that meant. Harsh conditions, brutal guards, little chance of survival. "You have 3 days to prove your innocence," the colonel continued. "Until then, you'll be confined to quarters under guard." As Aiko was led away, she glanced back at Thomas. Her expression wasn't one of fear or anger, but of resigned acceptance. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Rain drummed on the canvas roof, matching the pounding in his head. Something didn't add up. Why would Aiko steal morphine? And if she had, why hide it so close to where she worked? Making a decision, Thomas grabbed his crutches and raincoat. Moving quietly, he slipped out into the downpour. The camp was mostly dark, with only a few lanterns glowing in the officers' quarters and at guard posts. Thomas made his way carefully around puddles, heading for the supply depot. He needed to look at the scene of the crime himself. Behind the infirmary, Thomas examined the rocky area where the vials had been found. In the dim light from his pocket flashlight, something caught his eye. Small footprints, too small for a man's boot, leading not toward the prisoners' quarters, but away from camp. Curious, Thomas followed the tracks. They led to a gap in the fence, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Beyond lay jungle, dark and mysterious in the rain. Thomas hesitated. Following the trail meant leaving camp, a risky move for anyone, especially a wounded soldier. But the need to know the truth pushed him forward. Squeezing through the gap, Thomas found himself on a narrow path winding through thick vegetation. The going was slow and painful on his crutches, but the trail was clear. Someone used it regularly. After 20 minutes of difficult travel, Thomas saw a flicker of light ahead. As he got closer, he realized it was candlelight coming from the windows of a small, half-ruined chapel. Moving cautiously, Thomas approached. Through a broken window, He could see Aiko kneeling beside a makeshift bed where a young Filipino child lay, face flushed with fever. Several other children huddled nearby, watching with wide, frightened eyes. Aiko opened a small medical kit and removed a vial. Morphine, Thomas realized with a shock. With practiced hands, she prepared a tiny dose and administered it to the suffering child. The door creaked as Thomas pushed it open. Aiko turned, startled, then froze when she saw him. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "You took the morphine," he said quietly, not a question. Aiko straightened, facing him squarely. "Yes." Thomas looked at the children, 5 of them, thin and scared, the youngest no more than 4. "For them?" Aiko nodded. "Village bombed, parents gone. This boy, Manuel, burned badly, pain very bad." She met Thomas's eyes without flinching. "I know punishment, but could not let child suffer." Thomas moved further into the chapel, lowering himself onto a rough wooden bench. "Why didn't you tell the colonel?" "He is soldier, must follow rules of war." Aiko gently stroked the sick child's forehead. "Rules say I am enemy, but children not enemy to anyone." Thomas watched as she tended to the boy, speaking softly in a mixture of Japanese and broken Filipino. The other children crept closer, no longer afraid. "How long have you been caring for them?" Thomas asked. "Since first week here. Found them hiding in jungle." Aiko's face softened as a little girl climbed onto her lap. "They call me sister." The smallest child approached Thomas curiously, touching his uniform sleeve with a tiny hand. "American," Aiko explained to the child. "Friend." "Friend." The word hung in the air between them. "I stole," Aiko said finally. "Not deny. In law, guilty. In heart." She placed her hand over her chest. Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand." As the rain continued to fall, Thomas helped Aiko care for the children. He shared the chocolate bar from his pocket ration. He told simple stories that Aiko translated. He held a cup of water for the sick boy, while Aiko changed his bandages. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Thomas had made his decision. "I'll speak to the colonel," he promised. "At sunrise." Aiko shook her head. "He will punish you too, for helping me." "Maybe," Thomas admitted. "But he's a fair man, and these children need help, more than we can give in secret." As Thomas prepared to leave, Aiko touched his arm lightly. "Why help me? Still enemy." Thomas thought about his answer carefully. "My father taught me that how we treat others shows who we really are, not who they are." Aiko considered his words, then nodded. "Wise father." "He was," Thomas agreed, thinking of the man who had died just before the war began. "I hope I make him proud." Dawn was breaking as Thomas made his way back to camp. The rain had stopped, leaving the jungle fresh and vibrant. Birds called from the treetops, and steam rose from the damp earth. Outside the colonel's quarters, Thomas took a deep breath and knocked. Whatever happened next, he knew he was doing the right thing. "Colonel?" Harrison listened without interrupting as Thomas told the whole story. The chapel, the children, Aiko's secret mission of mercy. When Thomas finished, the colonel remained silent for a long moment, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "She admitted stealing the morphine?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir. She doesn't deny it." "And these children? They're from a bombed village?" "Yes, sir. Orphans, as far as she knows." The colonel rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the camp as it came to life with morning routines. "You realize, Private, that by regulation, I should punish both of you. Her for theft, you for leaving camp without permission and failing to report her activities." "I understand, sir." Thomas said, standing as straight as his crutches would allow. The colonel turned, his weathered face thoughtful. My father was a missionary in China. He taught me that sometimes mercy matters more than military precision. He sighed heavily. But I'm responsible for this camp, for the safety of our men. Sir, if I may, Thomas ventured. Aiko hasn't just helped those children. Ask any man in the infirmary how she's cared for them. She saved Sergeant Miller when his fever spiked 2 nights ago. She's shown nothing but compassion to everyone, friend and foe alike. A long silence followed. Outside, soldiers called to one another. A jeep engine sputtered to life. I cannot and will not condone theft, the colonel said finally. But perhaps there's another solution. He sat down at his desk and began writing. Instead of punishment, I'm assigning Miss Tanaka to official medical outreach duty. She'll work with the local civilian population under guard, including those children. Relief washed over Thomas. Thank you, sir. The colonel fixed him with a stern look. Don't thank me yet, Weller. You'll be part of her guard detail as soon as that leg heals properly. And I expect every milligram of medicine to be properly requisitioned and accounted for from now on. Understood? Yes, sir. As Thomas left the colonel's office, the camp bustled with morning activities. Soldiers saluted as he passed, some nodding respectfully, others turning away with disapproving frowns. News traveled fast in a small camp. By noon, everyone knew about Aiko's secret mission and the colonel's unusual decision. That evening, Thomas found Aiko in the small chapel, lighting a candle before a simple wooden cross. Her face glowed in the soft light, peaceful despite all she had endured. Thomas stood quietly in the doorway, watching as she bowed her head in prayer. Different languages, different customs, different sides of a terrible war. Yet here, in this moment of reverence, none of that seemed to matter. Something was changing, not just between them, but in the hearts of the men who witnessed their story. A small seed of understanding had taken root. In the midst of war's darkness, a fragile light of compassion had begun to shine. Letters from home arrived. On a muggy afternoon 3 weeks later, soldiers gathered eagerly around the mail truck, shouting with joy when their names were called. Thomas waited patiently, leaning on a single crutch. His leg had healed enough that the doctor allowed him to walk short distances without support. Weller, called the mail clerk. 2 for you. Thomas took the letters, recognizing his mother's neat handwriting on one envelope. The other was from his uncle in Chicago. He tucked them in his pocket, planning to read them in private later. Across the compound, Aiko worked with a group of Filipino children, showing them how to clean and bandage minor cuts. Under the colonel's new arrangement, she spent mornings in the camp infirmary and afternoons teaching basic medical care to locals. A guard still followed her, but the atmosphere had changed. Less suspicion, more respect. By dinner time, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Thomas sat alone on a bench outside the mess tent, finally opening his letters. The first, from his mother, contained news of home, the spring planting, church events, neighbors' children getting married. Normal life continuing despite the war. Her words brought comfort, a reminder that somewhere, peace still existed. The second letter made Thomas's hands tremble. Dear Thomas, his uncle wrote, it pains me to tell you that your brother Michael's ship was sunk in the Pacific last month. The Navy reports that he went down with his vessel. Your aunt and I are heartbroken. We know you two were close despite your differences. Thomas couldn't read further. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. Mike, his older brother, who had joined the Navy instead of staying on the farm, who had taught Thomas to fish and swim, who had promised they would open a garage together after the war, was gone. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, matching the tears that now ran freely down Thomas's face. "Bad news?" asked a soft voice. Thomas looked up to find Aiko standing nearby, concern in her eyes. He hadn't heard her approach. "My brother," he managed to say. "His ship was sunk. He's gone." Aiko's face softened with understanding. Without a word, she sat beside him, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Thomas folded the letter with shaking hands. "He was on the USS Spencer, naval battle near the Marshall Islands." He swallowed hard. "He was only 24. Aiko stared at her hands folded in her lap. After a long moment, she spoke very quietly. "My brother, too. Same battle." Thomas turned to look at her. "What?" "Takeo, my brother, on destroyer Akizuki." Her voice trembled slightly. "Same battle. Now gone." The rain fell harder now, drumming on the canvas above them. Thomas felt a strange hollowness in his chest. Their brothers, fighting on opposite sides, both lost in the same distant waters. "How old?" he asked. 22. Aiko's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Very smart. Studied engineering. Wanted to build bridges after war." "Mike wanted to open an auto repair shop," Thomas said. "He could fix anything with an engine." For a long time, they sat in silence, two people from enemy nations, united in grief. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas. Somewhere in the Pacific, American and Japanese sailors had died trying to kill each other, while here, their siblings sat side by side in shared sorrow. "Makes no sense," Thomas said finally. "All this fighting, all this dying." "War never makes sense," Aiko agreed softly. "Only people suffer." Thunder rolled across the camp. The rain became a downpour, sheets of water turning the ground to mud. Neither moved to seek better shelter. "In my village," Aiko said, "we believe rain washes away sorrows, takes tears to see." She extended her hand, palm up, letting raindrops splash against her skin. "Perhaps to where brothers rest." Thomas did the same, feeling the cool water against his palm. "I like that thought." A flash of lightning illuminated Aiko's face, not as enemy, not as nurse, but simply as another human being carrying the heavy weight of loss. "Would you pray with me?" Thomas asked suddenly. "Each in our own way?" Aiko nodded. Together, they bowed their heads. Thomas murmuring the Lord's Prayer his mother had taught him, Aiko whispering words in Japanese. Different words, different gods perhaps, but the same hope for peace reaching toward the same rain-dark sky. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean. Thomas woke early, his heart still heavy with grief, but somehow lighter for having shared it. After breakfast, he found Aiko already at work in the infirmary. She nodded in greeting but didn't speak. Some things were too deep for casual conversation. Later, as Thomas helped organize medical supplies, Aiko approached with a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said, pressing it into his hand before moving away to attend a patient. In private, Thomas unfolded it, a sketch of two paper boats floating on water, with Japanese characters beneath. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. They're brothers, sailing together in calmer seas. That afternoon, rain threatened again. The orphaned children Aiko cared for had taken shelter in the small chapel beyond the camp fence. Thomas, now assigned as part of her guard detail, accompanied her to check on them. The chapel's roof leaked badly, water dripping through in a dozen places. The children had clustered in the driest corner, huddled together for warmth. "Not good," Aiko said, examining the ceiling. "Need fix." Thomas nodded, looking around for materials they could use. "We can patch it temporarily." Here, help me move these benches. Together, they rearranged the chapel's sparse furniture. Thomas climbed awkwardly onto a bench, testing his weight on his healing leg. With Iko handing up pieces of scavenged wood and canvas, he managed to cover the worst leaks. Outside, the rain intensified. Inside, despite their efforts, water still found its way through the damaged roof. The youngest child began to cry, frightened by thunder. Iko gathered the little ones close, speaking soothingly. To calm them, she began to sing softly, a gentle melody that rose and fell like waves. "What song is that?" Thomas asked when she finished. "Old hymn," Iko explained. "From mission school where I learned nursing." She hummed a few more bars. Thomas smiled in surprise. "I know that tune." He began to sing the English words his mother had taught him. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." Aiko's eyes widened. "Same song." Together they sang, Iko in Japanese, Thomas in English, their voices blending in harmony that needed no translation. The children watched, wide-eyed, their fears forgotten. When they finished, the smallest boy tugged at Thomas's sleeve, saying something in rapid Filipino. "He asks if God speaks all languages," Iko translated, smiling. Thomas knelt to the child's level. "Yes," he said simply. "I reckon he does." From the doorway came a slow clapping. They turned to find Colonel Harrison standing there, rain dripping from his hat. "Don't stop on my account," he said. "That's the finest singing I've heard since leaving the States." Thomas and Iko exchanged surprised glances. "Just checking on you two," the colonel explained. "Storm's getting worse." He surveyed the patched roof with approval. "Nice work, but it won't hold long. We should get these children to better shelter." "Where, sir?" Thomas asked. The colonel thought for a moment. "The storage tent near the mess hall is mostly empty since the supply drop got delayed. We can set them up there until the weather clears." Thomas was stunned. Bringing Filipino orphans into the American camp was unprecedented. "Thank you, sir," he managed to say. The colonel shrugged. "War makes enough orphans without us adding to the count by neglect." He looked directly at Iko. "Your compassion has been educational, Miss Tanaka." Under the colonel's protection, the children were brought to the camp and settled in the storage tent. Soldiers donated extra blankets and rations. A few even brought small toys carved from spare wood. Tiny jeeps and animals that delighted the young refugees. That night, as Thomas helped Iko distribute soup to the children, he marveled at how much had changed in just a few weeks. The same men who had once demanded Aiko's punishment now nodded respectfully as they passed, some even offering shy smiles to the Japanese nurse who had taught them something about courage and compassion. "Colonel is good man," Iko observed quietly. "Strong, but not hard." Thomas nodded. "He reminds me of my father. Stern when needed, but always fair." "Your father? He would be proud, I think," Iko said, remembering their conversation in the chapel. Thomas considered this. "I hope so." As the children settled to sleep, Thomas and Iko sat near the tent entrance, listening to the storm. Something had shifted between them. Grief shared, music exchanged, purpose aligned. "Tomorrow sunny?" Iko predicted, gazing at the canvas ceiling. "After big storm, always comes clear sky." Thomas smiled at her optimism. "I reckon you're right." Iko's prediction proved correct. Morning brought sunshine and the sweet scent of rain-washed earth. The camp buzzed with activity as soldiers took advantage of the good weather to repair storm damage and hang wet gear to dry. Shortly after breakfast, a courier arrived with dispatches from headquarters. The colonel called his officers for a meeting, their faces growing serious as they read the papers. "What's happening?" Thomas asked Bailey as they watched officers hurrying across the compound. Word is all enemy nationals are being moved inland, Bailey replied. Security concerns after that raid on Bataan last week. Thomas's heart sank. All of them? Even medical personnel? Bailey nodded. Orders from command. No exceptions. Throughout the morning, Thomas watched for Aiko. But she remained busy in the infirmary, unaware of the coming separation. He debated whether to tell her, but decided the news should come officially. By midday, rumors had spread throughout the camp. When Thomas finally found Aiko during lunch, she was sitting alone, her face composed but sad. You heard? He asked, settling beside her. She nodded. Colonel told me. 2 days, then go. She attempted a small smile. Is war. I understand. But Thomas didn't understand. After all Aiko had done, the lives she'd saved, the trust she'd earned, how could they send her away like this? I'll speak to the colonel, he promised. Aiko shook her head. No use. Orders are orders. She looked around the camp, her gaze lingering on the infirmary and the children playing near the storage tent. Was good time here, despite everything. That evening, the camp gathered for a special meal. The cook had prepared rice and a simple fish stew, as close to Japanese cuisine as possible with limited supplies. It was a small gesture of respect for Aiko. She accepted the honor with quiet dignity, serving others before taking her own portion. Thomas watched as soldiers who had once scorned her now sought her out to shake her hand or express awkward thanks. Never thought I'd be saying goodbye to a Jap with actual regret, murmured Sergeant Miller, whose life Aiko had saved during his fever. Guess people can surprise you. After the meal, Thomas helped Aiko pack her few belongings, the medical dictionary they had created together, a small sewing kit, the sketches they had exchanged. Her hands moved efficiently, but Thomas noticed they trembled slightly. I'll write to you, he said. After the war. Aiko paused, looking up at him. Will be difficult. Japan and America. I don't care about that, Thomas insisted. We're friends now. That's what matters. Aiko considered his words, then nodded slowly. Friends, she repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Yes. As night fell, Thomas walked her back to her quarters for the last time. They paused at the door, both reluctant to say goodnight when so few remained. Thomas, Aiko said suddenly, thank you for seeing person, not enemy. Thank you, he replied, for teaching me how. They stood in silence for a moment, the vast gulf of war and nationality between them somehow narrowed by shared humanity. Good night, Aiko, Thomas said finally. Oyasumi, Thomas, she replied softly. Good night. The ground began to shake before dawn. Thomas woke to his cot rattling beneath him. Objects fell from shelves. Outside, men shouted in alarm. The earth rumbled with a sound like distant thunder. Earthquake. Thomas grabbed his crutch and stumbled outside. All around, soldiers rushed from tents and barracks. The ground bucked and heaved. Get to open ground! Someone yelled. Away from the buildings! Through the chaos, Thomas saw the infirmary tent collapse, its central pole snapping like a twig. Horrified, he remembered the wounded men inside, at least a dozen patients unable to escape on their own. Without thinking, Thomas ran toward the fallen structure. Others were doing the same, pulling at canvas, calling out names. Dust filled the air. Sanchez is still in there, shouted a corporal. And Miller. Thomas spotted Aiko running from the women's barracks, her face pale with determination. She reached the collapsed infirmary seconds before he did. Support beams, she said quickly, pointing. Holding tent, not stable. She was right. The wooden frame that had supported the large tent was partially intact, creating pockets where patients might have survived, but it was cracking under the weight of fallen equipment. As the earth continued to tremble with aftershocks, Aiko made a decision. Before anyone could stop her, she ducked under a fallen beam and crawled into the wreckage. "Aiko, no!" Thomas called after her. "It's not safe!" But she was already inside, calling out to the trapped men. Thomas heard faint responses. At least some were alive. Minutes crawled by. Soldiers gathered around, trying to lift heavy beams without causing further collapse. Then came Aiko's voice, muffled but clear. "Found Sanchez! Alive! Pass blanket for pulling!" Someone thrust a blanket through an opening. Moments later, the wounded sergeant emerged, bloody but breathing, dragged on the makeshift stretcher. "Miller still inside," Sanchez gasped. "Near medicine cabinet." Aiko disappeared again into the ruins. The ground gave another violent shake. Wood splintered ominously. "It's coming down!" someone shouted. "Everyone back!" But Thomas couldn't move. Not without Aiko. "Aiko!" he called desperately. "Get out of there!" A flash of movement caught his eye. Aiko dragging Sergeant Miller by his arms, both of them covered in dust. She had almost reached the opening when the support beam above her cracked. Thomas lunged forward, ignoring the pain in his leg. He grabbed Miller's shoulders, pulling with all his strength. Others joined him, hauling the injured man to safety. But Aiko was still inside. Thomas reached for her hand just as the beam gave way. Their fingers touched briefly, then the structure collapsed completely. "No!" Thomas screamed, digging frantically at the debris. "Aiko!" Hands pulled him back as more beams threatened to fall. It took 3 men to restrain him. "You can't help her if you're dead too," shouted the colonel, appearing at his side. "Get the rescue teams! Now!" For the next hour, men worked tirelessly, removing debris piece by piece. Thomas worked alongside them, ignoring his doctor's orders, driven by desperate hope. Finally, they found her, unconscious. Her small body curled protectively where the last beam had missed her by inches. Blood trickled from a wound on her forehead, but she was breathing. "Alive!" Thomas called, his voice breaking with relief. "Get a stretcher!" As they carried her to the hastily established aid station, her eyelids fluttered. She murmured something in Japanese. "What's she saying?" asked the medic. Thomas leaned closer. "Water?" he translated. "She's asking for water for the others." Even now, barely conscious, her first thought was for those in her care. The colonel stood nearby, watching the scene with thoughtful eyes. Without a word, he turned and strode to the communications tent, which had remained standing. That evening, as the camp began to recover from the earthquake, Thomas sat beside Aiko's cot. Her head was bandaged, her right arm splinted, but the doctor had assured him she would recover. "You shouldn't have gone in there," he said when she finally opened her eyes. Aiko's lips curved in a faint smile. "You would do same." Thomas couldn't argue with that. "Miller's asking for you," he said instead. "Wants to thank you properly this time." "Good man," Aiko murmured. "Brave. Not as brave as you." The tent flap opened, and Colonel Harrison entered, looking tired but satisfied. "Miss Tanaka," he said formally. "How are you feeling?" "Better, sir, thank you." The colonel nodded. "Good. Because I've just received a response to my telegram." He held up a piece of paper. "In light of your extraordinary actions during the earthquake, Headquarters has approved my request. You will not be transferred inland with the other prisoners." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. "She can stay?" "As a full medical auxiliary, not a prisoner," the colonel clarified, "with appropriate privileges and protection under the Geneva Convention." Aiko's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Colonel." "Don't thank me," he replied gruffly. "You earned it. Now get some rest. We're going to need every medic we can get in the coming days." After the colonel left, Thomas took Aiko's hand. "You're staying," he said, still amazed. "Hi," she whispered. "Ah, staying." Outside, men worked by lantern light to rebuild what the earthquake had destroyed. Inside, in the quiet of the makeshift ward, something else was being built, something stronger than the forces that sought to divide them. 3 days later, Aiko was well enough to resume light duties. The men had built a new infirmary, smaller but sturdier than before. Thomas watched as she entered for the first time, walking slowly but steadily. A surprise awaited her. On the wall hung a simple Red Cross armband, handmade from scraps of uniform fabric. Beneath it stood a dozen soldiers, including Miller and Sanchez. "For you," Sanchez said, presenting the armband. "From all of us." Aiko accepted it with a deep bow, too moved to speak. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, laughter drifted from the mess tent. The cook had attempted to make dumplings under Aiko's instruction. The results were oddly shaped but delicious. Thomas found Aiko sitting outside, listening to the rare sound of joy in the camp. "Good medicine," she said, nodding toward the laughter. "Better than pills." Thomas smiled. "You've changed things here, you know. Changed us." Aiko shook her head. "Not me. All of us, together." She looked at him thoughtfully. "You were first to see differently. Others followed." From the edge of the compound came the sound of children singing, the orphans, safe in their temporary home, learning American songs from friendly soldiers. "What happens when war ends?" Aiko asked suddenly. "Japan, America still enemies?" Thomas considered her question. "Countries might be enemies," he said slowly, "but people can choose differently." Aiko nodded, understanding. "Like planting seeds," she said, gesturing toward the small vegetable garden they had started near the chapel. "Small now, but grow." As darkness fell over the camp, bringing a momentary peace to their corner of a world at war, Thomas thought about those seeds of understanding, of compassion, of seeing the humanity in those labeled enemy. Such seeds might seem fragile in the harsh soil of war, but they had taken root nonetheless. And with care and courage, they might grow into something stronger than hatred, more enduring than conflict, something like hope. Jack Durnell watched from the shadows as Thomas and Aiko tended the small garden beside the chapel. His fingers twitched against his rifle strap, eyes narrowed with resentment. 23 days had passed since the earthquake, and Durnell hadn't forgotten his hatred. "Traitor," he muttered under his breath, watching Thomas laugh at something Aiko said. Durnell had lost his brother at Pearl Harbor. Each time he saw the Japanese woman moving freely around camp, wearing that handmade Red Cross armband, his anger deepened like a festering wound. "Trouble?" asked Bailey, approaching from behind. Durnell straightened, forcing a neutral expression. "Just keeping an eye on our pet Jap." Bailey frowned. "Watch your mouth, Corporal. She saved Miller and Sanchez during the quake. Would have saved you too, if you'd been trapped." "We'll see about that," Durnell replied cryptically, turning away. Bailey watched him go, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. Later that day, he found Thomas checking inventory in the supply tent. "Weller," he said quietly, "you might want to watch out for Durnell. He's been eyeballing Aiko something fierce." Thomas looked up from his clipboard. "Thanks for the warning. I'll keep an eye on him." But Thomas underestimated Durnell's bitterness. That night, as the camp slept, Durnell slipped into the newly rebuilt infirmary. He moved silently between cots where patients dozed, toward the small alcove where medical supplies were stored. From inside his jacket, he removed a knife, the standard issue blade every soldier carried. With a glance over his shoulder, he tucked it beneath Aiko's cot, pushing it far enough back to remain hidden during casual cleaning, but certain to be found during a thorough inspection. "Let's see how much they trust you tomorrow," he whispered, slipping away into the darkness. Morning arrived with the blaring of the bugle. Thomas woke refreshed, despite the ever-present humidity that made everything damp to the touch. He dressed quickly and headed to breakfast, nodding to fellow soldiers along the way. The camp had fallen into a more comfortable routine in recent weeks. The war continued, but in their small corner of it, something like normal life had emerged. The colonel had expanded Aiko's medical outreach program, allowing her to train several local Filipinos in basic nursing. The orphaned children now attended makeshift classes taught by a sergeant who had been a school teacher before the war. Thomas spotted Aiko in the mess tent, sitting with the camp doctor as they discussed treatment plans. She looked up as he approached, offering a small smile. "Morning inspection today?" she reminded him, pointing to his unpolished boots. Thomas grinned. "Thanks for the reminder. The colonel would have my hide." After breakfast, soldiers assembled on the parade ground, standing at attention as officers moved through the ranks. Thomas stood tall, his leg now almost completely healed. From the corner of his eye, he saw Durnell, a strange smile playing at his lips. The inspection proceeded as usual until a commotion erupted near the infirmary. "Colonel! Sir!" called the quartermaster, emerging from the tent. "You need to see this!" Colonel Harrison broke off his inspection and strode toward the infirmary, officers trailing behind him. Thomas felt a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. "Stay in formation!" barked the sergeant, but curiosity was too strong. Men began to drift toward the growing crowd outside the medical tent. "Found under her cot," Thomas heard someone say, during routine cleaning. Pushing through the crowd, Thomas saw the colonel holding a knife, his expression grave. Aiko stood nearby, her face pale but composed. "Is this yours, Miss Tanaka?" the colonel asked formally. "No, sir," she replied steadily. "A standard military knife was discovered beneath your sleeping area," the colonel continued. "Do you have any explanation for how it got there?" Aiko shook her head. "No, sir." From the edge of the crowd, Durnell stepped forward. "Sir, I saw her near the armory yesterday. Thought it was strange at the time." Murmurs rippled through the gathered soldiers. Thomas stared at Durnell, suddenly understanding. "That's a lie," he said loudly. "Aiko was in the garden with me all yesterday afternoon." The colonel raised a hand for silence. "This is a serious matter. Unauthorized possession of weapons by non-military personnel is strictly forbidden." He turned to Aiko. "I have no choice but to confine you to the stockade until this is investigated." "She's being framed," Thomas protested. "Sir, after everything she's done?" "That's enough, Private." The colonel cut him off. "I must follow procedure." His eyes softened slightly as he addressed Aiko. "I'm sorry, Miss Tanaka, but please come with me." As two guards escorted Aiko toward the small building that served as the camp's jail, Thomas confronted Durnell. "I know what you did," he hissed, "and I'll prove it." Durnell smirked. "Good luck with that, Jap lover." Thomas's fist connected with Durnell's jaw before he could think better of it. The corporal staggered back, then lunged forward. Within seconds, they were grappling on the ground, throwing wild punches as soldiers gathered around them. "Break it up!" roared the sergeant, pulling them apart. "Have you both lost your minds?" "He planted that knife!" Thomas shouted, struggling against the hands holding him back. "He's trying to frame her." "That's enough!" The colonel's voice cut through the chaos. Private Weller, you will join Miss Tanaka in confinement. Striking a fellow soldier is a serious offense. As Thomas was led away, he caught Durnell rubbing his jaw, that same satisfied smirk on his face. Rage boiled inside him, but beneath it lay a deeper fear. What would happen to Aiko now? The stockade was little more than a reinforced shed divided into 3 small cells. Thomas found himself in one, with Aiko in the adjacent space. A thin wall separated them, but through a crack between boards, they could speak in whispers. Night fell early, bringing with it the sounds of insects and distant thunder. A single lantern hung in the corridor outside their cells, casting long shadows through the bars. I'm sorry, Thomas said, sitting with his back against the dividing wall. I lost my temper. Not your fault, Aiko replied softly, but now both in trouble. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to think clearly through his anger. Durnell planted that knife. I know it. Why such hate? Aiko wondered. What did I do to him? His brother died at Pearl Harbor, Thomas explained. He blames all Japanese. Silence fell between them. Outside, rain began to patter on the tin roof. I understand his pain, Aiko said finally. Lost ones make heart hard. Thomas marveled at her compassion. How can you forgive so easily? Through the crack, he saw Aiko's profile as she tilted her head thoughtfully. Not easy, she admitted. Choice. Every day, choose again. My father used to quote the Bible about that, Thomas said. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Aiko nodded. Same teaching in my village, different words, same truth. She hesitated, then asked, Will you say prayer with me, like before? In the dim light of the lantern, Thomas began to recite Psalm 91, the words coming back from childhood Sunday school. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. To his surprise, Aiko joined in, her accented voice blending with his. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. You know it, Thomas said, amazed. Mission school, Aiko explained. We memorize many psalms. Together they recited the ancient words of comfort, their voices a quiet harmony in the darkness. Outside, the colonel passed by on his evening rounds, pausing to listen. His weathered face softened momentarily before he continued on his way, troubled thoughts weighing on his mind. As the lantern burned low, Thomas and Aiko fell silent, each lost in private thoughts. The rain grew heavier, drumming steadily on the roof. Whatever happens, Thomas said suddenly, I won't let them send you away. Aiko didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice held quiet resignation. Some things cannot be fought, Thomas, like rain, like earthquake. This isn't a force of nature, Thomas insisted. It's one bitter man with a grudge. Many bitter men, Aiko corrected gently. Many grudges. War makes them. Thomas had no answer for that. He pressed his palm against the wooden wall, wishing he could offer more than words. On the other side, though he couldn't see it, Aiko did the same. Dawn brought the colonel to the stockade. He entered looking grave, carrying a folded piece of paper. Miss Tanaka, he said formally. Headquarters demands swift judgment in cases involving enemy nationals. They've ordered an immediate tribunal. Thomas jumped to his feet. Sir, she deserves a fair investigation. One night isn't enough time to— I'm well aware, Private, the colonel interrupted sharply. He lowered his voice. I've bought us as much time as I can. The tribunal will convene at sunrise tomorrow. He turned to Aiko. I've brought paper and ink. You're permitted to write one letter home. Aiko bowed slightly. Thank you, Colonel. After the colonel left, Aiko sat cross-legged on her small cot, carefully composing her letter in flowing Japanese characters. Through the crack, Thomas watched her brush move with quiet dignity. "What are you writing?" he asked softly. "To my parents," she replied, "thanking them for teaching mercy even to enemies." She looked up, meeting his eye through the narrow opening. "Telling them I found friend where I should find only hate, good memory to leave." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Don't talk like that. This isn't over." Aiko continued writing. "Colonel is good man, but rules of war are strong. Knife is evidence? Your word against Durnell's." She set down her brush, letting the ink dry. "I am prepared." Later that afternoon, the colonel returned for Aiko's letter. He read the translation provided by the camp's interpreter, his expression unchanging. But as he folded the paper, Thomas saw a flicker of emotion in the older man's eyes. "I will ensure this reaches your family," he promised. Then, almost to himself, "And I will deliver justice in this camp, whatever form it takes." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. Through the wall, he could hear Aiko's steady breathing. How could she rest so peacefully with tomorrow's tribunal looming? Her capacity for acceptance amazed him. As first light crept through the small window of his cell, Thomas heard movement outside. The door opened, and Bailey appeared. "Time to go, Weller," he said quietly. "The colonel wants you at the tribunal." Thomas's heart raced. "As witness?" Bailey nodded. "Looks like you'll get your chance to speak after all." The camp gathered on the parade ground as the sun rose over the distant mountains. At the center stood a makeshift table where the colonel sat with two other officers. Aiko stood before them, her posture straight and dignified despite her rumpled clothes. Thomas was led to one side, still under guard, but permitted to witness the proceedings. Across the assembly, he spotted Durnell, looking confident and self-righteous. "This tribunal is now in session," announced the colonel. "Corporal Durnell, step forward and state your accusation." Durnell marched to the center, saluting crisply. "Sir, I observed the prisoner acting suspiciously near the armory on multiple occasions. I believe she took the knife with the intention of attacking American personnel or aiding an escape." "Do you have witnesses to these observations?" asked the colonel. "No, sir," Durnell admitted, "but the evidence speaks for itself. The knife was found under her cot." "Thank you, Corporal. You may step back." The colonel turned to Aiko. "Miss Tanaka, do you wish to speak in your defense?" Aiko bowed slightly. "Only truth I can tell. Did not take knife. Did not hide knife. Have no reason for weapon." "Private Weller," the colonel called. "You claimed Miss Tanaka was with you when Corporal Durnell allegedly saw her near the armory. Can you verify this?" Thomas stepped forward, ignoring Durnell's glare. "Yes, sir. Aiko was helping me in the garden from noon until dinner. She never went near the armory." Murmurs spread through the assembled soldiers. The colonel called for silence. "Are there any other witnesses who wish to speak?" To Thomas's surprise, Sergeant Miller limped forward, his leg still bandaged from injuries sustained during the earthquake. "Sir, I'd like to testify." The colonel nodded. "Proceed, Sergeant." Miller cleared his throat. "When the infirmary collapsed, I was trapped under a beam. I was conscious but couldn't move. Miss Tanaka crawled through spaces too small for any of our men. She could have left me, should have, when the building started coming down again. Instead, she covered my body with hers as the beams fell." He turned to face the assembled soldiers. "I owe her my life. A person willing to die for an enemy doesn't need to steal a knife to hurt them." One by one, others stepped forward. The doctor who worked alongside Aiko, Filipino villagers who had learned from her, soldiers whose wounds she had tended with gentle hands. "She sang to me when the pain was bad," said a young private with a bandaged chest. "Her voice kept the nightmares away." "She taught my daughter how to clean wounds properly," said a village elder. "Now my child can help others." As each person spoke, Thomas watched Durnell's confident expression falter. The corporal shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting around as if seeking escape. Finally, the colonel turned to the assembled camp. "Having heard the testimony, this tribunal will vote. Those who find Miss Tanaka not guilty, raise your hands." Hands rose throughout the crowd. First a few, then dozens, then nearly everyone. Only Durnell and a handful of others kept their hands down. The colonel nodded solemnly. "The tribunal finds Aiko Tanaka not guilty of weapons theft or conspiracy." Relief washed over Thomas. He caught Aiko's eye across the parade ground, sharing a moment of quiet joy. But the colonel wasn't finished. He rose from his seat, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. "There remains the matter of how the knife came to be under Miss Tanaka's cot." He turned to Durnell. "Corporal, do you have anything else to say?" Durnell swallowed hard. "No, sir." "Very well." The colonel's voice hardened. "Based on the overwhelming testimony of Miss Tanaka's character and the suspicious nature of the evidence, I am ordering a full investigation into the planting of false evidence. Until that investigation is complete, Corporal Durnell will be confined to quarters." As guards escorted a pale-faced Durnell away, the colonel addressed Aiko. "Miss Tanaka, you are free to return to your duties. Your Red Cross status is confirmed and will be fully recognized." Aiko bowed deeply. "Thank you, Colonel." The colonel pounded his desk with his fist. "Let this be understood by everyone in this camp. We owe Miss Tanaka not just gratitude, but our conscience. In showing mercy to an enemy, she has reminded us of our own humanity." He looked around at the assembled soldiers. "We are fighting this war to defend principles of justice and dignity. If we abandon those principles, even in dealing with the enemy, then we have already lost what matters most." As the assembly dispersed, Thomas was officially released from confinement. The first thing he did was seek out Aiko, finding her outside the infirmary, already preparing to resume her work. "You're free," he said, still hardly believing it. Aiko smiled softly. "Was always free here," she said, touching her heart. "Now just official." Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in days. "You know what I mean." She nodded, her eyes twinkling. "Yes, I know." Weeks passed. Summer faded into autumn, bringing slightly cooler days and occasional relief from the oppressive humidity. The war continued beyond their small corner of Luzon, but in the camp, a different kind of battle had been won. One against hatred and suspicion. Thomas and Aiko expanded their garden beside the chapel, planting vegetables and herbs that supplemented the camp's rations. Soldiers and local villagers often joined them, working side by side in the rich soil. They used salvaged canteens as watering cans, poking small holes in the metal to create a gentle shower for tender seedlings. The sight of American Army canteens nurturing Japanese herbs became a fitting symbol of their unlikely friendship. One bright morning, as they worked together hoeing a new row for planting, Aiko paused, listening. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "Different sound," she said, tilting her head. "The guns. More distant now." Thomas hadn't noticed, but she was right. The rumble of artillery that often punctuated their days had grown fainter, as if the front had moved away from them. That afternoon, a telegraph from headquarters confirmed Aiko's observation. The colonel gathered everyone for an announcement. "I've received word that an armistice may be coming within days," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly. Nothing is certain yet, but there are serious negotiations underway. A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd. Could it be true? Could the fighting actually end? "We will continue our duties as usual," the colonel cautioned. "But I thought you should know." His eyes found Aiko in the crowd. "All of you deserve to know." That night, the cook prepared a special meal, not a celebration exactly, but a moment of hope. Someone found an old record player, and music drifted across the compound. A few soldiers even danced, awkward but joyful. The colonel asked Aiko to lead them in prayer. She stepped forward, nervous but honored, and began a hymn in halting English. Her clear voice rose in the evening air, soon joined by others. Thomas stood beside her, their voices blending as they had in the stockade, no longer separated by walls. Later, as lanterns glowed across the camp, Thomas found Aiko sitting alone by the garden, looking at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling beside her. "Thinking of home," she admitted. "Will it still be there, after bombs, after fighting?" Thomas had wondered the same about many places during this long war. "We'll rebuild," he said, simply. "All of us." Aiko nodded. Different world after war. What place for friendship like ours? It was a question Thomas had avoided thinking about. What would happen to them when the fighting stopped and nations drew their boundaries again? Would the understanding they had found be enough to bridge such divides? "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I reckon if we could find common ground in the middle of war, we can find it in peace too." Aiko smiled at that. "Wise words, Thomas Weller." "I have a good teacher," he replied. A week later, official word arrived. An armistice had been signed. After years of brutal fighting, the war was ending. Bells rang in nearby villages. Soldiers threw their caps in the air. Some wept openly, thinking of homes and families they might see again. Others remained solemn, remembering those who would not return. The colonel called Thomas to his office that afternoon. "Weller," he said without preamble, "I've received new orders regarding Miss Tanaka. With the armistice, all medical personnel are being granted priority discharge to assist with civilian casualties." Thomas felt a mix of emotions. Happiness for Aiko's freedom, sadness at the thought of her leaving. "When?" he asked simply. "Transport leaves tomorrow morning." The colonel handed him a folder. "These are her discharge papers. I'd like you to deliver them." Thomas found Aiko at the chapel, teaching the orphaned children how to fold paper cranes. Her face lit up when she saw him, then grew serious as she noticed the folder in his hand. "News?" she asked. Thomas nodded. "You're being discharged. Tomorrow morning." Aiko took the papers, reading slowly with her still improving English. "Free to go," she murmured. "Free to help civilians." "Will you go back to Japan?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. She shook her head. "Not yet. Too much need here. Many sick. Many hurt." She looked at the children folding paper. "Many alone." Relief flooded Thomas, followed by guilt for feeling relieved. Of course she should go home if she wished, but the thought of her staying, even if not right beside him, lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. That evening, as transport wagons were prepared for the following day's departures, Thomas helped Aiko gather her few belongings. Among them was the sketch he had made of his family farm. "You keep," she insisted when he tried to return it. "To remember Iowa." "I have something for you, too," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small locket, his mother's, sent to him for safekeeping during the war. Inside was a tiny photograph of his parents on their wedding day. "I can't take this," Aiko protested. Family treasure. Family is meant to be shared, Thomas said firmly, pressing it into her hand. Like the stories we tell, like the seeds we plant. Aiko's eyes filled with tears. She closed her fingers around the locket and bowed deeply. Thank you, she whispered. We'll keep safe always. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold as the transport wagons prepared to leave. Aiko stood beside the lead vehicle, wearing her Red Cross armband and carrying a small pack containing her possessions. The entire camp had gathered to say goodbye. Soldiers who had once viewed her with suspicion now lined up to shake her hand or offer awkward bows they had learned from watching her. Take care of yourself, Miss Tanaka, said Sergeant Miller, his voice gruff with emotion. Don't go crawling into any more collapsed buildings. Unless someone needs help, Aiko replied with a small smile. The colonel approached, extending his hand formally. Your service to this camp has been exemplary, Miss Tanaka. It has been an honor. Aiko bowed deeply. Honor mine, Colonel. Thank you for seeing with clear eyes. Finally, Thomas stepped forward. So much to say, so few words that seemed adequate. I'll walk you to the road, he said simply. They walked in silence past the garden they had tended together, past the chapel where they had sung the same hymn in different languages, past the place where they had first locked eyes across a dusty yard. At the road, the driver called for final boarding. Aiko turned to Thomas, her dark eyes memorizing his face. Right when you get settled? Thomas asked. Hi, she nodded. You also. I will. They stood awkwardly, neither knowing the proper way to say goodbye across the boundaries of culture and war. Thomas, Aiko said finally, in my language, we do not say goodbye when parting is not forever. She took his hand briefly. We say matinee, until we meet again. Matinee, Aiko, Thomas repeated carefully. She smiled at his pronunciation, then climbed aboard the wagon. As it pulled away, Thomas watched until the dust of the road swallowed her small figure, his heart both heavy and somehow fuller than before. 6 months later, on the Weller family farm in Iowa, Thomas hung freshly washed sheets on the clothesline while his mother prepared lunch in the kitchen. The winter had passed, and spring painted the fields in vibrant green. Soon it would be planting season again. Thomas had been home for 3 months, discharged with honors and a slight limp that bothered him only on cold mornings. He had returned to find the farm in need of work after years of skeleton crews. His mother and hired hands had done their best, but there was much to repair. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Thomas threw himself into the labor, finding healing in the familiar rhythms of farm life. Yet often, his thoughts drifted to a small garden on Luzon and the hands that had worked alongside his own. Mail's here, called his mother from the porch. Thomas secured the last sheet and headed toward the house. His mother handed him several envelopes, bills, a letter from his uncle, and an official-looking envelope with foreign stamps. His heart quickened. The return address read, Manila, Philippines. Inside the house, Thomas opened the letter with careful fingers. Several pages fell out, along with a small photograph. He unfolded the first page, recognizing Aiko's neat handwriting, her English much improved. Dear Thomas, she wrote, I hope this letter finds you well and your leg fully healed. I am writing from Manila, where I have established a small clinic for orphaned children. With help from American aid workers and local families, we have created a place of healing called the Well of Grace. Thomas smiled at the name, remembering their first meeting beside the creek. The children are learning English and Japanese, along with their native dialects. The letter continued. We believe understanding different languages helps build bridges between cultures. Something you taught me is possible even in the most difficult circumstances. He turned to the photograph. It showed a group of children gathered around a hand pump built cleverly from salvaged canteens, just like those they had used to water their garden. Aiko stood among them, looking tired but happy, his mother's locket visible around her neck. Thomas read the letter twice more, then carried it to the porch where his mother was shelling peas. "Who's it from?" she asked, noting his expression. "Remember I told you about the Japanese nurse who saved my life?" Thomas sat beside her, handing her the photograph. "This is Aiko." His mother studied the picture, her wise eyes taking in every detail. "She gave you water when you had none?" she said, remembering his story. Thomas nodded, looking out across the fields where new life pushed through the soil, seeds planted in faith that they would grow. "And she gave me a home in her heart," he added softly. His mother smiled, understanding more than he had said. "Some bonds can't be broken by oceans or borders," she observed, "not when they're rooted in mercy." As the spring breeze carried the scent of freshly turned earth and the promise of growth, Thomas thought of seeds planted not just in Iowa soil, but in the hearts of those who had learned to see beyond uniforms and flags to the humanity beneath. Such seeds might take time to grow, might face storms and drought, but with care and courage, they could flourish into something beautiful and lasting, a harvest of peace that no war could destroy. In a small clinic in Manila and on a farm in Iowa, two people from enemy nations continued to tend those seeds, nurturing the fragile roots of understanding that had begun beside a muddy creek, where one simple act of mercy changed everything. The wind whispered through the sheets on the line, carrying Thomas's whispered words across time and distance. "Mata ne, Aiko, until we meet again